The story begins at its inevitable end. Derek Brown kneels on oil-stained concrete in the abandoned Packard plant warehouse, his dark hair disheveled for the first time in 2 years, his carefully groomed beard now matted with sweat and Detroit grime. A gun presses cold against his temple. The fluorescent lights overhead flicker and buzz like dying insects, casting shadows that dance across rusted machinery and forgotten assembly lines, the ghosts of an industrial empire that died before his criminal one was born. In this frozen moment, Derek sees it all with terrible clarity. The execution wasn't random violence. It wasn't even betrayal in a traditional sense. Tommy Novak's finger on the trigger is simply the final moving part in a machine Derek engineered himself. Every calculated decision, every methodical expansion, every brick he laid with precision, all of it was scaffolding for his own gallows. He built an empire that could only end one way, with him kneeling in the exact warehouse where it all began, waiting for the sound of his own design pulling the trigger. His final thought before the metallic click echoes through the empty plant: I welded every link in this chain, and now it's wrapped around my throat. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. We are introduced to Derek Brown on the day Detroit killed the last piece of his father. It's October 1987, and he's 32 years old. Dark hair swept back with a kind of precision that suggests control in a world spiraling into chaos. Piercing eyes that calculate angles and outcomes before most men finish their first thought. A neatly trimmed beard that gives him an edge of refinement, a man who still wears dignity like armor even as everything around him rusts and collapses. He stands on the floor of the Chrysler plant for the last time, watching the assembly line fall silent like a heart stopping mid-beat. Detroit is hemorrhaging. The auto plants that once made this city roar, that employed his father for 30 years until a machinery malfunction crushed him between stamping dies, now stand as hollow monuments to a dream that died quietly while everyone was looking the other way. The pink slip in Derek's hand isn't a surprise. It's a confirmation of what he already knew: the American dream doesn't just die. It gets foreclosed on, auctioned off, and left to rot in abandoned factories where men like his father bled out their lives. His mother drank herself to death in a house the bank repossessed 6 months later. She taught him that mourning doesn't pay mortgages. Derek learned early that Detroit doesn't reward loyalty, it devours it. The city has no memory for the men who built it, only appetite for those who can adapt to what it's becoming. In the Rust Belt, survival isn't inherited from your father's work ethic or your mother's prayers. It's purchased with the willingness to see the city as it actually is, a dying animal that will feed whoever's hungry enough to take the knife. That night, in a bar that smells like cigarette smoke and desperation, a man named Kozlov slides into the booth across from him. Motor City's dying, Brown, Kozlov says, lighting a cigarette. You can die with it, or you can find another way. Derek's hands are steady when he shakes on it. Not because he's fearless. Because he's already done the math. 2 years from now, those same hands will build an empire from Detroit's industrial corpse. And 2 years after that, they'll tremble as a gun presses against his temple in a warehouse he should have burned to the ground the moment he walked away from the assembly line. But tonight, in October 1987, Derek Brown still believes he can control the machine. Tonight, he doesn't yet know that every blueprint he draws will be a schematic for his own execution. The assembly line groaned its death rattle at 4:47 p.m. on October 23, 1987, and Derek Brown stood in the center of the floor watching 30 years of his father's life bleed out in real time. The sound was wrong, not the rhythmic thunder of production that had been the Chrysler plant's heartbeat since before Derek was born, but something hollow and final, like bones breaking in slow motion. Around him, men who'd spent decades becoming extensions of the machinery now stood frozen, their hands still positioned for work that would never come again. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that sickly industrial glow that made everyone look already dead. Derek's station was on the chassis line, the exact spot where his father had worked for 28 years before the stamping dies crushed him between metal teeth in 1985. Sometimes, in the roar of production, Derek swore he could still hear his father's voice, not screaming, just the steady instructions he'd given when Derek was 16 and working summer shifts. Precision, son. Every bolt matters. You build it right, or you don't build it at all. His father had built everything right. The plant had killed him anyway. Now the silence felt like an autopsy. Foreman Jack Mitchell moved through the floor like a pallbearer, pink slips clutched in his weathered hands. He'd worked alongside Derek's father, had been there the day the machinery malfunctioned, had helped pull what was left out from between the dies. When he reached Derek, he didn't meet his eyes. Brown, Mitchell said, and the single word carried the weight of every shutdown, every foreclosed house, every family that would splinter under the pressure of Detroit's slow collapse. He held out the slip of paper like it was contaminated. You're a good worker. Best precision I've seen since your old man. But Motor City's dying, kid. Derek took the paper. His hands didn't shake. He'd calculated this probability weeks ago, had already run the numbers on his savings, his mother's outstanding medical bills from her final year of drinking herself to death, the mortgage on a house the bank had repossessed anyway. The math was brutal and simple. Legitimate work in Detroit was a terminal diagnosis. Find another way or die with it, Mitchell said, and there was something almost apologetic in his gravel voice. Then he moved on to the next man, the next pink slip, the next small death in a city hemorrhaging its working class. Derek walked out through the plant gates for the last time as the October sun bled rust-colored light across the Detroit skyline. Behind him, the factory looked like a cathedral to a dead god, all that massive infrastructure built for a future that never arrived. His father had believed in this place the way some men believed in heaven. It had rewarded that faith by grinding him into spare parts. The bar on Michigan Avenue smelled like cigarette smoke, stale beer, and the particular desperation of men who'd outlived their usefulness. Derek sat in a booth near the back, nursing a whiskey he couldn't afford, watching the news report factory closures like casualty lists from a war nobody admitted was happening. That's when Kozlov slid into the booth across from him. He was older, maybe 50, with the kind of sharp features that suggested Eastern European ancestry and eyes that calculated like a machine. He didn't ask permission to sit. Men like Kozlov didn't need to. Derek Brown, Kozlov said, not a question. He lit a cigarette with practiced efficiency. Heard you got your walking papers today. Heard you're good with your hands. Precise. Derek said nothing, but his fingers tightened around the whiskey glass. Motor City's dying, Kozlov continued, smoke curling from his lips like industrial exhaust. The factories, the honest work, the American dream, all of it's bleeding out. You can die with it, or you can find another way. He leaned forward. Alternative employment. Good money. Precision work. Derek met his eyes. He already knew what Kozlov was offering. Already knew what saying yes would cost. But his father's ghost was still trapped in that silent plant, and his mother was already underground, and Detroit was a corpse that only fed the hungry. His hands were steady when he shook on it. Not because he was fearless. Because he'd already done the math. The Packard plant had been dead for 30 years, but it still had a pulse if you knew where to look. Derek learned this on a November night cold enough to make the abandoned factory feel like a mausoleum, his breath clouding in the darkness as he helped Tommy Novak unload 12 boxes of stolen electronics from a truck with plates that wouldn't trace anywhere useful. His hand shook, not from the cold, but from the understanding that this was the threshold, the moment when he stopped being his father's son and became something the old man would have beaten him bloody for becoming. The boxes were heavy. Sony trinitrons, VCRs, stereo systems, consumer goods that had fallen off a delivery truck in a way that was clearly intentional but legally ambiguous. Derek had spent his whole life building things with precision. Now he was learning that dismantling the law required the same careful attention to detail. Tommy moved through the darkness like he owned it, which in some sense he already did. They'd grown up 3 houses apart in a neighborhood that had collapsed into itself like a lung full of factory smoke. While Derek had gone legitimate, spent years on the assembly line trying to honor his father's memory, Tommy had adapted to Detroit's new economy with the kind of pragmatic ruthlessness the city now rewarded. He was leaner than Derek remembered, sharper around the edges, with a smile that calculated odds while pretending at friendship. "You're overthinking it, D," Tommy said, setting down a box with practiced ease. "It's just redistribution. These companies got insurance. Nobody bleeds." Derek's engineering mind automatically catalogued the lie in that logic, but his accountant's mind, the part that had been doing bankruptcy math since his mother drank herself to death, understood the truth underneath. In Detroit's collapsing economy, morality was a luxury purchased with stability, and stability was something the auto plants had auctioned off to the highest bidder. "You got the brains," Tommy continued, lighting a cigarette that glowed like a tiny furnace in the massive darkness of the plant. "I got the connections. Kozlov's got the infrastructure. We can own this city, man. Or at least own the parts of it that still matter." The buyers arrived at midnight, 3 men in a Cadillac that was too clean for this neighborhood, which meant they had money and protection. The transaction happened with the efficiency of an assembly line: inspection, negotiation, exchange. Cash that smelled like sweat and commerce changing hands for goods that had been liberated from the legitimate economy. Derek watched Tommy handle the buyers with easy confidence, making jokes that diffused tension, establishing dominance through casual competence. This wasn't Tommy's first deal. Maybe not even his 50th. While Derek had been building transmissions, Tommy had been building a different kind of infrastructure, one that operated in the shadows of Detroit's industrial corpse. When the Cadillac pulled away, Tommy counted the cash with quick fingers, then split it down the middle without hesitation. "600 for you, 600 for me. Kozlov gets his cut from the supplier side. Clean, simple, profitable." Derek stared at the money in his hands, more than he'd made in 2 weeks at the plant, earned in 2 hours of work his father would have called sin. His hands had stopped shaking. That should have bothered him more than it did. "You feel it?" Tommy asked, reading something in Derek's face. That's the difference between dying slow in a factory and actually living. Detroit doesn't owe us shit, D. A time we stopped owing it anything back. They drove back through streets lined with foreclosed houses and shuttered businesses, past the massive silhouette of the Renaissance Center, that monument to Detroit's promised revival that never quite arrived. The cash in Derek's pocket felt like possibility, like the first variable in an equation he was only beginning to understand. He didn't feel guilt. That would have been simpler, cleaner, something he could have worked with or against. Instead, what settled over him was clarity, cold and precise as a blueprint. The assembly line had taught him that every system has breaking points, stress tolerances, predictable failures. Detroit's legitimate economy had exceeded its tolerances and collapsed. What Tommy was offering wasn't corruption, it was adaptation. When Derek got home to his studio apartment, he didn't count the money again. He already knew exactly how much was there, how many bills it would pay, how many weeks of survival it purchased. Instead, he stood at his window, looking out at the city's wounded skyline, and felt something in his chest go quiet. Not his conscience dying. Just his last illusions about what Detroit rewarded. Derek approached criminality the way his father had approached the assembly line, with precision, redundancy, and an engineer's understanding that every system fails eventually unless you build in safeguards. By December, he had notebooks full of routes mapped across Detroit's industrial wasteland, each one calculated for minimal police presence, maximum concealment, and alternate exits if things went wrong. He color-coded suppliers, buyers, and intermediate points. He created schedules that never repeated exactly, rotating patterns complex enough to avoid predictability but simple enough that Tommy's crew could execute them without thinking. What had started as moving stolen electronics became something larger, more systematic, a machine built from Detroit's criminal infrastructure the same way Ford had once built cars from raw materials and human labor. Tommy handled the parts of the business that required a different kind of precision. While Derek architected, Tommy enforced. When a buyer tried to short them in January, Tommy broke the man's hand with a tire iron in the same Packard plant warehouse where they'd made their first deal. When a competing crew tried to muscle into their territory in February, Tommy orchestrated a response so swift and brutal that nobody challenged them again for 3 months. He moved through violence the way Derek moved through logistics, with practiced efficiency and no wasted motion. They were perfect complements, Derek realized. He provided the blueprint. Tommy provided the consequences for anyone who deviated from it. Kozlov watched their expansion with the detached interest of a patron observing promising students. He was their connection to the larger criminal ecosystem, the man who'd first offered Derek alternative employment in that bar 6 months ago. Eastern European, probably Russian, though he never confirmed it. Old enough to have survived things that would have killed softer men, smart enough to recognize talent when he saw it bleeding out in a city that had stopped caring. They met in a diner on Grayshot Avenue in late March, one of those places where the coffee tasted like rust and the waitress had stopped asking questions about anything years ago. Kozlov ordered eggs and toast, ate with methodical precision, then pushed a newspaper across the table. A small article about a warehouse fire that had consumed what remained of a rival operation's inventory. "You didn't start that fire," Kozlov said, not a question. "No," Derek confirmed. The fire had been convenient but sloppy, the kind of thing that drew attention they didn't need. "Good." Kozlov sipped his coffee, his pale eyes calculating something Derek couldn't quite read. Too many young men think power is taken. They see territory and grab it. See competition and eliminate it. This is animal thinking. It works until it doesn't, and then you burn down with the warehouse. Derek said nothing, waiting. Kozlov had taught him that silence extracted more information than questions. "Power isn't taken," Kozlov continued, lighting a cigarette the waitress pretended not to see. "It's architected. You build infrastructure. Establish dependencies. Create systems where people need you more than they fear you. Your father worked the assembly line, yes. 28 years, Derek said quietly. He understood something important then. A factory isn't just machines. It's relationships between parts. Each piece depends on the others. Remove one piece, everything stops. Kozlov tapped ash into a chipped saucer. You're building a factory, Brown. But you're building it in a city where the old factories died. Make yours different. Make it necessary. By April, Derek had expanded their operation across 6 territories, each one running like a separate assembly line that fed into a central distribution system. He'd recruited drivers, lookouts, middlemen, each one knowing only their specific role, never the full blueprint. Compartmentalization, his engineering textbooks had called it. In legitimate manufacturing, it prevented cascade failures. In criminal enterprise, it prevented cascade arrests. Tommy brought in muscle, guys from their old neighborhood who'd learned that Detroit's legitimate economy had nothing left to offer them. Derek interviewed each one personally, assessed their capabilities, assigned them positions where their particular skills created maximum efficiency. He paid them reliably, treated them with respect, and made it clear that loyalty was rewarded while deviation was not. The empire grew in shadows cast by abandoned factories, fed by the corpse of Detroit's industrial past. Derek kept meticulous records in code only he could decipher, profit margins, risk assessments, personnel evaluations. Every deal was a data point. Every transaction was a variable in an equation that grew more complex and more profitable every week. He was building something his father would have recognized, even if he would have condemned it. A system where every part mattered. Where precision determined success. Where the blueprint was everything. Derek just hadn't calculated that every blueprint contains the schematic for its own destruction. The first crack appeared in May, hairline thin and easy to dismiss, the kind of structural flaw an engineer recognizes but tells himself doesn't compromise the foundation. Tommy showed up late to their Tuesday meeting at the warehouse, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the two men flanking him, Marco and Vince, neighborhood guys Derek recognized but hadn't vetted, hadn't interviewed, hadn't integrated into the system. They stood behind Tommy with the casual posture of men who belonged there, which meant Tommy had already told them they did. New recruits, Tommy said, lighting a cigarette before Derek could ask. Marco's good with a truck. Vince knows people on the east side. Figured we could use the expansion. Derek felt something tighten in his chest, not anger exactly, but the recognition that a variable had entered the equation without his knowledge. We talked about maintaining controlled growth. Every new person is a potential failure point. Yeah, we talked about it. Tommy's smile was easy, unbothered. Then I made a decision. That's what partners do, right? Make decisions. The word partners landed with subtle weight, redefining something that had previously been implicit. Derek had the blueprints. Tommy had the muscle. But Tommy was suggesting a different arrangement, one where authority wasn't determined by who architected the system, but by who was willing to act without permission. Marco and Vince said nothing, but their presence was a statement. Tommy had his own crew now, independent of Derek's careful organizational structure. It was efficient in its way. Tommy could move faster without running everything through Derek's analysis first. But efficiency wasn't the same as sustainability, and Derek's engineering mind automatically calculated the stress this would put on their infrastructure. He let it go. Not because he agreed, but because the alternative was confrontation, and confrontation with Tommy increasingly felt like testing whether the floor would hold your weight by jumping on it. The pattern repeated through May like a structural defect propagating through metal under stress. Tommy closed a deal in Hamtramck without clearing it through their established channels. He expanded their territory into an area Derek had specifically flagged as too high risk. He started carrying a gun openly, not concealed, a statement about authority that made their associates nervous in ways Derek couldn't quite quantify but definitely felt. At a strategy meeting in late May, Derek laid out his concerns with the precision he'd learned from his father. "We overextended. 3 of our routes are showing increased police presence. The Hamtramck expansion is operating at a loss. We need to consolidate, reassess, rebuild the redundancies we've compromised." Tommy leaned back in his chair, that same easy smile playing across his features. But his eyes, Derek noticed it then, really noticed it for the first time, had changed. They used to calculate the same way Derek's did, weighing risks and outcomes. Now they had a different quality, something harder and less patient. Hunger, maybe. Or the early stages of the thing that turned partners into competitors. "You think too much, D," Tommy said, and there was something dismissive in his tone that hadn't been there before. "All these calculations, all these blueprints, sometimes you just gotta act. Take the opportunity when it's in front of you, not after you've built a spreadsheet about it." Around the table, Tommy's crew, and Derek realized with quiet alarm that he was thinking of them as Tommy's crew now, not their crew, nodded agreement. Marco smirked. Vince studied Derek with a kind of assessment that suggested he was measuring him for something, though Derek couldn't tell what. "Action without planning is how systems fail," Derek said quietly. "Planning without action is how opportunities die," Tommy countered. "Detroit's not gonna wait for you to finish your equations, brother. It's gonna eat whoever's too slow to grab what's there." The meeting ended with nothing resolved, which was itself a resolution. Tommy left with his crew, their laughter echoing through the warehouse in a way that suggested they were laughing about something, or someone. Derek stayed behind, looking at his notebooks full of routes and protocols and carefully architected systems. His father used to say that the assembly line was only as strong as its weakest component. Derek had built an empire on that principle, testing every piece before installation, creating redundancies to prevent cascade failures. But he'd miscalculated one critical variable. Tommy wasn't a component in the machine. He was a partner with his own blueprints, his own ambitions, and increasingly, his own ideas about who should be giving orders. The foundation hadn't cracked yet. Not really. But Derek could hear it settling, the way old buildings groan before something structural gives way. The knife wound was shallow but messy, a 3-inch gash across Derek's forearm from a deal in River Rouge that had gone sideways when the buyer got nervous and his backup got aggressive. Tommy had handled the situation with his usual efficiency, meaning someone else bled worse, but Derek needed stitches and couldn't risk questions at a hospital emergency room. Sarah Hollis worked the night shift at Detroit Receiving Hospital, and according to Marco's cousin, she could be persuaded to handle off-the-books medical work for cash and discretion. Derek found her apartment in a relatively intact building near Palmer Park, one of those neighborhoods that hadn't completely surrendered to Detroit's decay. She answered the door in scrubs, her dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp with the kind of exhausted competence that came from years of patching people up in a city that kept finding new ways to break them. "You're bleeding on my doorstep," she said. "I was told you could help with that," Derek replied. She studied him for a moment, not the wound, but his face, his posture, the expensive watch he wore that didn't match the circumstance bringing him to her door at 11 p.m. Then she stepped aside. "Come in. Try not to bleed on anything I can't wash." Her apartment was a revelation. Clean in a way that suggested effort, not just absence of dirt. Books lined makeshift shelves, nursing texts, but also novels, philosophy, a worn copy of Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. Plants in the windows, alive and deliberately tended. The air smelled like something baking, not the cigarette smoke and desperation that permeated most spaces Derek occupied. She worked on his arm at her kitchen table with professional efficiency, cleaning the wound, numbing it with lidocaine she definitely shouldn't have had outside the hospital. Her hands were steady, precise, a different kind of precision than Tommy's violence or Derek's logistics, but precision nonetheless. "You going to tell me what happened?" she asked, threading a suture needle. "No." "Good." She began stitching with quick, practiced movements. "I don't want to know. I just want to know you're not going to show up here with something I can't fix with thread and antiseptic." "I'm careful," Derek said. Careful men don't need stitches at midnight. But there wasn't judgment in her voice, just observation. She finished the sutures, bandaged his arm, then sat back and looked at him with those sharp, exhausted eyes. "You don't seem like the others." Derek knew what she meant. The others, the men who probably showed up here with bullet wounds and knife fights and the accumulated damage of Detroit's criminal economy. Men like Tommy, who wore violence like a second skin. Men who'd stopped pretending they were anything other than what the city had turned them into. He didn't correct her. Didn't tell her that he'd helped build the machine that produced the others, that his hands were just as dirty even if the blood wasn't visible. Instead, he paid her twice what she asked for and left with her phone number written on a piece of paper that felt more dangerous than any weapon he'd carried. He went back the next week without an injury, just flowers from a shop that probably fronted for something else, and an excuse about wanting to thank her properly. She let him in with a skeptical smile that suggested she knew exactly what this was but was willing to see where it went anyway. They had coffee. Talked about nothing important, books she was reading, neighborhoods that used to be better, the way Detroit kept promising revival while the streets kept emptying out. She told him about nursing school, about her mother in Ann Arbor who thought she was crazy for staying in the city. He told her carefully edited versions of his life, the assembly line and his father's death rendered as tragedy rather than origin story. For 3 hours in her clean apartment that smelled like vanilla and possibility, Derek imagined a different equation. A future that didn't end in warehouses and blood. A life where precision meant healing instead of efficiency in criminal logistics. "What do you actually do?" Sarah asked finally, direct in the way of someone who'd spent too many years in emergency rooms to accept comfortable lies. "Import-export," Derek said, which was technically true in the way that murder is technically just accelerated mortality. She studied him with those sharp eyes, and he could see her calculating, weighing what she suspected against what she wanted to believe. "Just promise me something," she said finally. "Whatever it is you're doing, be careful. Really careful. Detroit's already full of ghosts." "I promise," Derek said, and meant it. He drove home through streets slick with June rain, past the Packard plant where his empire was architected in shadows, past the closed Chrysler factory where his father's ghost still worked a shift that would never end. Sarah's apartment building disappeared in his rearview mirror, warm light in windows suggesting lives that operated by different mathematics. For the first time since shaking Kozlov's hand in that bar 8 months ago, Derek wondered if he'd calculated wrong. August heat turned Detroit into a pressure cooker, the kind of oppressive humidity that made everything feel like it was waiting to explode. Derek had been feeling that same pressure in his arrangement with Tommy for weeks now, not open hostility, but the sense of tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface, grinding against each other in ways that would eventually produce an earthquake. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Derek was reviewing ledgers in his apartment, calculating profit margins that had started declining as Tommy's impulsive expansion ate into their operational efficiency. Tommy's voice on the phone had that forced casualness that Derek had learned to recognize as performance. "Got a routine pickup tonight. Packard plant. Suppliers got a shipment of high-end electronics, Sony's, top of the line. Easy money, old time's sake, you know." Tommy laughed, but it sounded mechanical. "Thought you might want to handle this one personally. Been a while since you got your hands dirty with the actual work." Derek's engineering mind automatically catalogued the anomalies. They hadn't used the Packard plant for major transactions in months, too exposed, too much their signature location. Tommy never called jobs routine unless he was trying to make them sound routine. And the invitation for Derek to handle it personally felt like bait disguised as nostalgia. "Why me?" Derek asked. "Because you're my partner, D. Because we started this thing together at that plant, and I thought it'd be good to remind ourselves where we came from." A pause. "Unless you don't trust me anymore." The question was a trap either way. Say yes and admit the fracture. Say no and walk into whatever Tommy had planned. Derek chose the path his father would have, meet the situation head-on, calculate the risks in real time. "What time?" he said. "Midnight. Like the first deal we ever did. Full circle, brother." Before the pickup, Derek took Sarah to dinner at a small Italian place in Greektown that still served decent food despite everything collapsing around it. She wore a blue dress that made her look like she belonged somewhere better than Detroit, somewhere the American dream hadn't bled out in abandoned factories. Derek had bought a new suit, clean and sharp, the kind his father would have worn to church back when his mother still prayed for things. "You seem different tonight," Sarah said, studying him over wine she pretended was better than it was. "Nervous." "I'm thinking about getting out," Derek said, and surprised himself by meaning it. "The import-export business. Finding something more stable." Sarah's smile was careful, hopeful in a way that hurt to see. "Really? Really? I've been doing the math. I've made enough to start over somewhere. Maybe somewhere that isn't trying to die." He reached across the table, took her hand. Her fingers were still slightly calloused from sutures and scalpels and saving people who probably didn't deserve saving. "Come with me." "When I do." "Derek," she started to say something, then stopped, her sharp nurse's eye seeing through to whatever truth he was barely admitting to himself. "Yes. Yes, okay. But soon. Promise me soon." "Soon," he said, and kissed her in a restaurant that smelled like garlic and borrowed time. He dropped her at her apartment at 11:15, watched her disappear into the building with its warm lights and living plants and the possibility of a life measured in something other than criminal logistics. Then he drove to the Packard plant, that massive corpse of American industry where his empire had been born and where his engineering mind was screaming now, something was fundamentally wrong with the equation. The warehouse was dark except for a single work light hanging from exposed beams, casting shadows that moved like living things. Derek's footsteps echoed on oil-stained concrete as he walked in, his engineer's eyes automatically noting details: no truck, no supplier, no electronics. Just empty space that suddenly felt like a trap fully sprung. Behind him, chains rattled. The heavy warehouse doors slammed shut with metallic finality. Tommy Novak stepped out of the shadows, gun already drawn, Marco and Vince flanking him with expressions that said this had been planned for weeks. Maybe months. Maybe from the moment Tommy had started building his own crew and stopped asking permission. "Sorry, D," Tommy said, and almost sounded like he meant it. "But you think too much. And guys who think too much eventually figure out they don't need guys like me." Derek's hands didn't shake. Not yet. He was still calculating, still running equations, still believing his precision could engineer a way out of a machine that had always been designed to end exactly here. "Old time's sake," Tommy said, echoing his own words from the phone call. "Full circle, brother." The gun pressed cold against Derek's temple, and he finally understood what his father had learned on the assembly line: every system, no matter how precisely built, contains the seeds of its own destruction. The concrete was cold under Derek's knees, oil stains spreading like prophecy beneath him where countless machines had bled out their fluids over decades of industrial death. The fluorescent work light swung slightly on its chain, making shadows dance across Tommy's face in a way that turned his features unfamiliar, or maybe just revealed what had always been there, waiting for the right equation to solve itself. "You got too careful, D," Tommy said, his voice carrying that same forced casualness from the phone call, except now there was no need to pretend. The gun in his hand was steady. Marco and Vince had positioned themselves at angles that eliminated escape routes, good tactical thinking, the kind Derek had taught them through example and protocol. Two other men emerged from deeper shadows, faces Derek recognized from Tommy's recent recruits. 5 total. Overwhelming force for one unarmed architect. Started thinking you were smarter than the rest of us. Derek's engineering mind ran calculations even now, even with cold metal pressed against his temple. Exit vectors, none viable. Negotiation leverage, minimal. Probability of survival, declining with each second Tommy kept talking instead of shooting. That last variable was interesting. If Tommy wanted him dead immediately, Derek would already be bleeding out. The monologue meant something: justification, maybe, or the human need to explain the machine before activating it. "I am smarter than you," Derek said quietly, because precision demanded honesty even now. "That's not arrogance. It's just math." Tommy laughed, but it sounded like breaking glass. "See? That right there. That's the problem." He circled Derek slowly, gun tracking his movement. "You think being smart means you win. But Detroit doesn't give a shit about smart, D. It cares about hungry. About willing. About who's ready to do what needs doing without building a fucking spreadsheet first." Marco shifted his weight, eager. Vince watched with cold assessment. The other two men were background elements, muscle without personality, the kind of components Tommy had learned to recruit and deploy. Derek had taught him that too, how to identify useful pieces and integrate them into operations. Now those lessons were being applied to his own execution. "Kozlov's on board?" Derek asked, still calculating. If Kozlov had sanctioned this, there was no infrastructure left to leverage. If he hadn't, maybe. "Kozlov doesn't care who runs the operation as long as it runs," Tommy interrupted. "That's another thing you never got. You thought all your blueprints and protocols made you indispensable. But systems outlive architects, brother. The machine keeps running after the engineer's gone." The fluorescent light buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting everything in sickly industrial glow. Derek's mind flashed to his father on this same concrete, crushed between stamping dies, killed by machinery he'd spent 28 years perfecting. Precision hadn't saved him. Loyalty hadn't saved him. The assembly line had eaten him anyway and kept running without missing a beat. "You built something beautiful," Tommy said, and for the first time there was something almost genuine in his voice. Maybe regret. Maybe admiration. Maybe just the human instinct to mark a moment before it ends. All those routes and redundancies, all that careful planning. It works, D. It really works. Best criminal infrastructure Detroit's seen in a decade. He knelt down, close enough that Derek could smell cigarette smoke and cheap cologne and the particular sweat of a man doing something he'd convinced himself was necessary. "But you forgot something," Tommy continued, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. "Builders don't get to live in the house. They pour the foundation, frame the walls, wire the electricity, then they cash their check and move on. You wanted to live here, Deed wanted to run it forever with your notebooks and your protocols. That's not how empires work." Derek thought of Sarah in her clean apartment, waiting for him to get out, believing he was different from the others. He thought of his father's ghost, still trapped on an assembly line that killed him and kept producing without memory or mercy. He thought of every precise decision he'd made over the past 10 months, every calculated expansion, every blueprint drawn with an engineer's faith that systems could be perfected. "Power isn't taken," Derek said, remembering Kozlov's words. "It's architected." "Yeah," Tommy said, standing up, gun still steady. "You architected this. Every piece. Every connection. Every choice that led you here." He stepped back, giving Marco space to move forward with rope. "Problem is, you architected yourself right into the center of a machine that only works one way. And you're standing in the gears, brother." They bound his hands with efficient brutality. Derek didn't resist. The math had finally resolved into its inevitable conclusion, the equation he'd been building since that first handshake with Kozlov in a bar that smelled like desperation and cigarette smoke. He'd built an empire from Detroit's corpse with the precision his father had taught him. And like everything built with precision in this dying city, it worked exactly as designed, right up until it consumed its creator. The first gunshot wasn't Tommy's. It came from the shadows behind Marco, a sharp crack that split the warehouse silence and sent Marco sprawling forward, his forehead blooming red before he understood he was dead. Tommy spun, confusion replacing certainty, and in that fraction of a second when the machine malfunctioned, Derek moved. His father had taught him that assembly lines only pause for catastrophic failure. This was catastrophic failure. More gunfire erupted from the darkness, automatic weapons, professional cadence, not the sloppy spray of street muscle but the calculated fire of people who'd done this before. Vince went down. One of Tommy's recruits tried to run and caught 3 rounds in the back. The warehouse transformed into a killing floor, and Derek's bound hands became the only thing keeping him from being mistaken for a combatant in whatever war had just invaded his execution. Tommy fired blindly into shadows, his careful setup dissolving into chaos. Derek rolled behind a rusted pillar as bullets sparked off metal and concrete, his engineering mind automatically tracking trajectories even as his body moved on pure survival instinct. The rope binding his wrists had loosened slightly when Marco fell, sloppy work rushed in the excitement of the kill. Derek worked his hands frantically, feeling skin tear as the rope gave incrementally. Then pain exploded in his shoulder, sharp, hot, followed immediately by another impact low in his ribs. He'd been shot. Twice. By who, he couldn't tell. Maybe Tommy's panicked fire. Maybe whoever had crashed the execution. In the chaos of collapsing infrastructure, it didn't matter. His hands came free. Derek moved through the warehouse on instinct and memory, the blueprint he'd memorized months ago guiding him through darkness toward the maintenance tunnels his father had once told him about, access corridors for the old Packard plant machinery, most of them sealed, but one that led under the street to an adjacent building. Behind him, the gunfire intensified. Someone was screaming. Glass shattered. The smell of cordite and blood-filled air that had tasted like industrial death for 30 years. He found the tunnel entrance behind a collapsed shelving unit, squeezed through an opening barely wide enough for his shoulders, and crawled into darkness that smelled like decay and rust and his own blood. Behind him, something exploded, propane tanks, ammunition, the accumulated volatile materials of criminal enterprise finally achieving critical mass. The tunnel shook. Dust and debris rained down. Derek crawled faster, his wounded shoulder screaming, ribs grinding with every movement, leaving a trail of blood on concrete that hadn't seen light since Detroit still believed in resurrection. He emerged 3 blocks away, pulled himself out of a basement access in an abandoned building, and stumbled into August heat that felt like drowning. Blood soaked his shirt, his expensive suit now just evidence of catastrophic system failure. Sarah. He needed Sarah. Her steady hands, her clean apartment, her belief that he was different from the others. He drove his car one-handed, vision blurring, running red lights through empty streets because Detroit at 1 a.m. belonged to ghosts and sirens. Sarah's building materialized through blood loss and shock, warm lights in windows promising salvation. The door to her apartment hung open. Derek stumbled inside, his name dying in his throat. Furniture overturned. Books scattered like casualties. Blood on the floor, not enough to be fatal, just enough to mark violence. And in the center of the kitchen table, a single business card, FBI Field Office, Detroit. Not Tommy's men. Worse. The law had found her first. Sarah was gone, vanished into whatever protection the government offered civilians caught in criminal crossfire. They would have told her everything. Shown her evidence. Explained exactly what Derek Brown really was, what he'd really built while she'd been imagining futures that didn't smell like oil and cordite. She would think he was the danger. Would believe the government's version where she was the victim and he was the predator who'd used her clean apartment and careful hands as camouflage for empire building. They would have made her understand that nurses don't date architects of criminal infrastructure and survive. Derek left before his blood contaminated more of her space, before sirens that were definitely getting closer could triangulate his location. He made it 2 blocks before his legs stopped working, collapsed in an alley between buildings that had been dead longer than his father, surrounded by Detroit's industrial corpse and his own spreading blood. Above him, the August sky was the color of rust and burning warehouses. In the distance, sirens wailed their judgment on men who thought precision could engineer salvation. Derek's last conscious thought was mathematical. He'd calculated every variable except the one that mattered most. You can't blueprint your way out of a machine designed to consume its creator. Derek survived because Detroit had taught him that survival was just engineering applied to flesh instead of steel. A veterinarian in River Rouge pulled the bullets out for cash and silence, the kind of man who'd learned medicine on farm animals and applied it to humans when the city's economy made distinctions like that irrelevant. Derek spent September in a room above a closed butcher shop, fever dreams mixing with calculations, his body slowly knitting itself back together while his mind blueprinted demolition. Sarah was gone. Tommy had his empire. The warehouse had burned. Everything Derek had built with precision now operated without him, which proved Tommy right about one thing: systems outlive their architects. But Tommy had forgotten the corollary: architects know where the structural weaknesses are. By October, Derek could walk without bleeding. By November, he'd become something Detroit had always specialized in producing, a ghost haunting his own construction. He started with the supply lines, the careful routes he'd mapped across the city's industrial wasteland. Anonymous tips to police about shipments, not enough to compromise the whole network, just enough to create friction, make things unpredictable. He knew the schedules because he'd created them, knew which cops could be bought and which couldn't because he'd done the research. Every redundancy he built into the system became a vulnerability once you knew where to apply pressure. In December, he approached Kozlov in that same diner on Greyshot where the old man had taught him about architected power. Kozlov looked older, or maybe Derek was just seeing him clearly for the first time, not a patron or teacher, just another parasite feeding on Detroit's corpse. "You're alive," Kozlov said, not surprised. Men like him had survived worse than warehouse fires. "Tommy's expansion is failing," Derek said. 3 territories hemorrhaging money. 2 suppliers on the verge of cutting ties. The infrastructure's collapsing because he doesn't understand maintenance, only acquisition. "And you want me to remove him?" Kozlov sipped coffee that had gone cold. "I want you to do nothing," Derek corrected. "Just watch what happens when systems designed for precision get operated by hunger instead of intelligence." Kozlov studied him with those pale, calculating eyes. "You're not trying to reclaim it?" "No." Derek pushed a folder across the table, 6 months of meticulous documentation, every weakness in Tommy's operation catalogued with an engineer's attention to detail. "I'm trying to demolish it. All of it. The whole machine. Including my investment. Including everything." Derek stood, his ribs still aching where the second bullet had cracked bone. "You taught me power is architected. But you never taught me what to do when the architecture becomes its own prison." Through winter, Derek moved through Detroit like an equation solving itself. He turned suppliers against distributors, leaked information that put 3 of Tommy's top men in interrogation rooms, created cascade failures in the network by removing the carefully designed redundancies that had kept it stable. Every decision Tommy made to compensate for one crisis created 2 more, because Tommy operated on instinct and hunger while Derek had spent 10 months learning the mathematics of criminal infrastructure. He didn't want revenge. Revenge was emotional, inefficient, the kind of thinking that got you killed in warehouses. He wanted demolition, clean, systematic, thorough. The same precision his father had applied to assembly lines, applied instead to tearing down everything Derek had built in the shadows of those dead factories. By March, Tommy's empire was hemorrhaging. Territories lost, suppliers gone, muscle arrested or disappeared. The FBI had been building a case for months using information from sources they thought were confidential informants but were actually just Derek, feeding them everything they needed to dismantle what Tommy had stolen. The final meeting happened where it had to, the Packard plant warehouse, rebuilt after the fire, still operating because criminal infrastructure was more resilient than legitimate business in a city that had stopped caring about the difference. Derek walked in through the same doors where Tommy had chained him in August. 7 months hadn't erased the oil stains on concrete where Marco had died, where Derek's blood had pooled while his execution collapsed into chaos. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the same dying insect sound, casting the same sickly glow across rusted machinery and abandoned assembly lines. Tommy knelt in the center of the floor, hands bound behind his back, Marco and Vince's replacement standing guard with guns and expressions that said they didn't understand why their boss was the one on his knees. Federal agents waited outside. Derek had timed it perfectly, had given them everything they needed to move the moment he walked out. "Derek." Tommy's voice was raw, stripped of the casual confidence that had once made him seem larger than circumstances. "Brother, we can fix this. You know the system better than anyone. Help me rebuild it right this time." Derek knelt down, close enough to smell Tommy's fear, sweat and desperation, the particular scent of a man watching his machine devour him from the inside. "You were right about one thing," Derek said quietly. "Builders don't get to live in the house." He stood, looking down at Tommy kneeling on oil-stained concrete, positioned exactly where Derek had knelt 7 months ago. "But architects know where the demolition charges go. You're just gonna let them take me? After everything we built?" "I didn't build anything," Derek said, already walking toward the door. "I just drew blueprints for a prison and then locked us both inside." Difference is, I found the exit. Behind him, Tommy was shouting something, threats or pleas or justifications. Derek couldn't tell and didn't care. Outside, sirens were closing in with mathematical precision, arriving exactly when Derek's anonymous tip had told them to. Federal agents would flood the warehouse in 90 seconds. Tommy would spend the next 20 years in a different kind of assembly line, one that processed men instead of cars but broke them just as efficiently. Derek walked away from the Packard plant for the last time as Detroit's March wind cut through his jacket with the same cold indifference that had killed his father and his mother and every honest dream this city had ever pretended to protect. He had no empire. No partner. No Sarah waiting in a clean apartment that smelled like possibility. But he had something his father never got, the knowledge that sometimes the only way to win is to demolish the game board completely, walk away from the wreckage, and refuse to build another prison disguised as salvation. Detroit kept dying behind him. Derek kept walking. The equation was finally solved. The end. Before you go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think you would have handled the situation if you were in Derek's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below.